Hello and welcome to the ScrapbookPal YouTube channel. This is Jill with Jill Cameron Creations. Today we are creating a Slimline card. We're going to be using Spellbinders Stitched Hi, Tufted 3D Embossing Folder, the Halftone Slimline Oval, the Be Bold Blooms die set, and we're also going to be using a Glimmer hot foil plate, the Mini Everyday Sentiments. My color palette is in the background there. I'm using a brushed rose gold foiled paper and also a pink that really matches it, and some sagey greens that are in a mid-tone and a darker color, and then also gray, and of course white. On the high, I'm using a mid-tone sage color pearlized embroidery floss. You will also see later in the video that I use a very large-eyed needle that's pretty short and kind of fat. It's a whole lot easier to use than a regular embroidery needle. To start, I trimmed down the gray cardstock to 3 3/4 by 8 1/2 and spritzed that with some water. That allows me to get a really crisp impression on my cardstock because that cardstock is about 110 pounds. So we're going to get started die cutting. I go ahead and I place the center portion of the Slimline oval inside of the outline of this so that it doesn't shift around and I still get really great alignment. I use washi tape to hold my dies together, and then I'll also use washi tape to hold the die in place. For these smaller Slimline dies, you can kind of cattywampus this on your plate so it cuts all the way through, or you can just put them half on and half off. The reason that I tape this down so well is that I have found with detailed Slimline dies, they will sometimes overcut as they shift when you put them back in on the other end. So I'm also pretty careful not to overcut on the same area twice when I just hang off my die off the end of the plate there. If you do this cattywampus, make sure that your paper isn't hanging over the edge of it so that it will go through as it's supposed to. You're just going to take your pokey tool and poke all of the insides of your die out and make sure they're nice and pretty. And I did have to go back and cut that again. Okay, so I'm cutting the background of the high, that outline there, out of the mirror cardstock, and then the high itself with the stitched holes in it. I'm doing that out of pink cardstock. I cut that out twice so that I can stack that together and have a nice base for my stitching. When I foil, I'm going to put the stack together kind of backwards. Remember, the pretty side goes towards the foiling plate itself, and I tape everything down to the cardstock so that it doesn't move around. This particular Glimmer set has an outline, coordinating outline for the sentiments, and I ran that through and cut that out. So now I have everything cut and I just need to stitch and then put everything together. I cut this one out 3 times. I forgot I cut this out 3 times. I am really kind of particular about stacking these up so that I make sure that all of the holes on each letter are aligned appropriately. Most of the time you stack letters and stuff together and it's just kind of like, oh, that looks good enough. This, I did kind of be very particular about it and took my time with it. You can see my needle right there under my hand laying on my mat. It is a thick needle compared to a general embroidery needle. And what I'm doing now is I'm tying 2 knots on top of each other at the end of my string so that I don't have to pull this through and I don't have to hold it on the back, because this particularly small is difficult for me to hold the thread down and then hold it in place so that I can cross it over. But I'm just doing a regular straight stitch from the outside to the inside. We're going to put some pearls on that at the end in those centers of each of those areas. I trim it off, I tie a little knot in it, and then I trim it off, and then I'll put some glue over top of both of the knots so that they stay in place. Now this one I'm just going to hold down. I'm holding that piece of thread with my finger, and then I'm just crossing over it so that it's going to hold in place automatically and I don't have any bulk there. This pearlized ribbon thread embroidery floss really does glide through here very easily, and I really do like this with paper. Now we're going to put together our little bloom sprig that we're going to have under our hi there. And I'm just popping out the little dots at the top. These are two different layers. You have a solid background, and then you have the front part of these that are have that texture in them and a little hole. A little dot of glue on each of these, and then I'm going to use a sticky thing to apply the tops of these and press them down. And that's it. Very simple to put these little sprigs together. And I used the dark green to cut out the sprigs that I'm going to put on the side of it to give it a little bit more dimension. For the stem for these, flip it over on its front and then add your dots of glue on the back, and then just pick these up and pop them right on the edge there, and that's all done. Do that lighter green and darker green little sprigs to the side. I'm going to glue those together in just a moment, and then we'll have all of our bits and pieces together and we can start putting our card together. When I first started making cards, I was a tape runner user, and then the liquid glue started coming out, and I don't think I have gone back to using anything but liquid glues since. And my Nuvo Deluxe adhesive is my favorite. Alright, so let's put all of our pieces together. I'm going to use foam tape around the edges of our Stitched Hi, because if you try to glue this down flat, it's not going to lay flat because it has stitching on the back of it. So I cut down some squares of foam tape and I put those on the back around the edges of it. Don't put the foam tape on the back of where you have stitched. And sorry, my head's going to get in the way here because I'm making sure that everything's lined up. And press down real good and pull that release paper off. And I think that's probably the most frustrating part of card making for me, is pulling that release paper off. Sorry, my big head is in the way. And I'm just pressing that down really good and making sure that my letters are centered on my background there. The H, you do have to kind of fool with it for a second to make sure that the leg of the H is in the right place. Now I'm going to put some liquid glue around the edges of this. You don't need much. If you've never used liquid glue before, you don't need but a little bit. It looks like I'm putting a lot on here, but the tip is actually touching the paper and I'm dragging the glue along with it, so it's just a really thin layer. Nuvo Deluxe adhesive stays wet just long enough and dries really quickly. Also, one thing that I use a whole lot to make sure that my things are glued down really well is a heavy acrylic block. I have one of those giant clear acrylic blocks, and I'll put it on top of everything to make sure that it's perfectly smashed down on my card front so it's not going to go anywhere. So press everything down really well. This is a textured background, so I wanted to make sure that I had glue in all the places. And I am putting a little bit more glue on the back of this than I normally would, and just in the spots that are going to touch that background there instead of all over the place. Set that down on there, and I'm using that folded edge to make sure that it's all nice and straight. And I'm going to use liquid glue here, and I did not put it behind the dot on the I so that I could scoot my things down in there as I needed to. This is our sentiment that we cut out, and I'm going to glue that to the front, and I just put that on the top area of where I stitched, and it was perfect. Now my stem is a little bit too long from where I'm going to put this, so I'm going to put a dot of glue in there, and I just trimmed off that little stem since we're tucking it back there and you're not going to see it anyway, and a little bit of glue on these edges and on this one, and that's it. Pearls after I finished videoing because I thought it needed just a little something else, so I did not get that. I'm so sorry, but I did add teeny tiny little pearls to the tops of my stitching there. And there's our finished card. Thanks so much for joining me today.